I hurriedly finished dressing, leapt astride my trusty BMW motorbike, a present from the recently departed Wehrmacht, and romped off to the guardroom. There was all hell on. 2 Marines were grappling with a large red-bearded young man, a stoker, who was apparently recovering from an all-night drinking session and wasn't enjoying the process. He was in a nasty, thoroughly homicidal temper, and the appearance of a sub-lieutenant RNVR, he was a regular, did nothing to improve his humour. The Marines were at full stretch to prevent him from eating me. The Master-at-Arms looked at me rather sadly. I could almost hear him. Christ, another bloody rookie. But he was a man of steel. He didn't say that at all. "Morning, sir. Stoker Doughty, sir. Did return on board drunk and disorderly, sir." He then closed 2 smart paces to the right until he was breathing down my left ear, assuming the role of a sinister prompter. In a whispered aside which Rommel might have heard, he said, "Put him in cells, sir." I stared at the stoker rather like a rabbit facing a particularly hungry python. "In your own interests, Doughty, I shall have you put into cells." There was a deep, seismic rumbling. "I'm not going in no bloody cells." "Tell him he bloody well is, sir." "Doughty, you bloody well are. I want to see a doctor." "He can't see a doctor, sir." "You can't see a doctor." What on earth was going on? Hadn't all this happened before, somewhere? Was it the Marx Brothers? Or Flanagan and Allen? It was pure burlesque. "I know my fucking rights." "He ain't got no fucking rights, sir." "You ain't got no rights." This was becoming ridiculous. I was almost hysterical. I was in the middle, and very much a part, of a cross-talk act, and could see no way out of the impasse. Fortunately, the Master-at-Arms was a man of resource. He had met plenty of my kind in his time. He was a dapper little man, expert in his trade, smart as a row of new pins. His face, irrigated by a mass of purple veins, and his tight-lipped mouth, precisely machined to accommodate the neck of a beer bottle, bespoke his hobby. He knew all about drunks. He made an agitated sign to me. "Christ, sir! There's the commander's car! For Christ's sake, stop him, just till we sort out this little lot!" I rushed out of the door. As I closed it behind me, I heard a quiet thud. There was no car, no commander. When I re-entered, the Marines had disappeared, and the Master-at-Arms was bending over his desk, sorting out the morning's charge sheets. "It's all right, sir. He went quiet enough to cells once you went out. If you don't mind me saying so, sir, I think it was your stripes that sort of put him off a bit. Made him restless-like, if you know what I mean. He'll be all right now, sir." I was learning. I was growing up. There were some things that an officer should not see. It was only by a pure fluke that I had even heard it. One of our messmates was Reggie Brooks, truly an ace among pianists. He was a lad with a dark complexion and jet-black hair, a lean young man in his early 20s. He was a professional, and music of every type flowed from his long, lean fingers in a profusion that baffled description. He had an angel's touch, and his readiness to sit down and to play whatever anyone called for made him one of the most popular fellows in the mess. He was also a capable pilot. One evening after dinner, shortly after my arrival at Tequila, I pulled over a chair, sat down at the bass end of the piano, and joined in with him. We quickly found that we thought on precisely similar lines where harmony was concerned. 1,000,000 to 1 shot. In a remarkably short time, we were swapping and changing ends, having a lot of fun. Our tastes varied from pop tunes of the times through ballads, piano transcriptions to Brahms' waltzes, and Dvorak's Slavonic dances. Both of us had good memories, and the total absence of music didn't appear to worry us. Where the bright lights and allures of Alexandria had called us most nights of the week, they now lost their attraction. So much so that after a few weeks, a once-weekly jaunt for a change of food or to see a new film was the only thing that interrupted the regular after-dinner jollies on the piano with Reg. Brooks, let it be said, had a weakness for old mother alcohol, which he enjoyed but couldn't hold. Being inclined to overindulge at times, he was apt to commit some act of childish exuberance when in his cups, and thereby incur the wrath of our commander, Jumbo Jackson. Jumbo was a genial soul, and it had to be something pretty bloody stupid to make him take notice. The result was that Brooks was regularly off the team, at which times he would cunningly do a vanishing act whenever Jackson appeared. During one of these spells, he approached me one day in a state of high excitement. Scrounging a drink in the Chief's and P.O.'s mess one evening, away from Jumbo's eagle eye, he had questioned one of his hosts about an upright piano standing in the corner. On finding, as he suspected, that the residents could find better things to do than play a fornicating piano, he had immediately struck up a provisional deal for its transfer. Now he was asking me to pursue it. "You're in Jacko's good books at present. See what he says. The P.O.'s mess will part with it for a couple of cases of Scotch." Scotch whisky at duty-free prices was a bargain in anybody's currency. I said I would do what I could. The commander didn't bat an eyelid. "Organise it, Hanson. Arrange for a removal party and I'll see to the whisky side of it. Get on with it." That very day we had our second piano in the mess, and Brooks was on the next bus into Alexandria to lay on a piano tuner to come out to pitch the two together. Now we were as happy as two pigs in a farmyard full of manure, if I may tidy up a famous New Zealander's expression. With a good piano each, we had infinitely more scope for our duets, and our hobby now became a nightly affair. Within a short time we were amazed to find that the habits of our messmates were altering. To our surprise, they took to staying aboard instead of trailing off to Alex. The bar profits soared to unheard-of levels, and to dispose of them became a real headache to our mess treasurer. Only by dint of throwing regular cocktail parties did we manage to dissipate them. By some means or other, Brooks later made contact with the Fleet Club in Alexandria, where concerts were regularly organised for service personnel. He quickly blackmailed the people in charge into staging a show by Brooks and Hanson, and the programme included in this book is the only record I now possess of the fun we had together in those happy days. I took the airmail to Port Said on October 23, 1942, and returned as usual next morning. Most of the chaps had left the mess when I arrived for breakfast, but one of the laggards said to me, "Just come in from Port Said?" I nodded. "Have you heard what's going on?" "No." "Well, all I can tell you is that there must be all hell breaking loose up the desert. At about 10:30 last night the whole place shook and every bloody door in the mess blew open. Somebody said it was an artillery barrage, but I told him to get stuffed." He was wrong. At about 10 o'clock the previous night, there broke over the Alamein positions the greatest artillery barrage in history, something that would have astounded even Napoleon, the greatest master of artillery of all time. The battle was on. The concussion or shock wave, with not a blade of grass to stop it, had come 35 miles down the desert to us. Things were never quite the same again. For a month or two we had noticed plenty of army movement up the road that ran westwards at the back of the airfield. The attack when it came, therefore, was probably no great surprise to us. Once the balloon had ascended, there was an enormous build-up, and the road was cluttered, night and day, with convoy after convoy. It wasn't long before hordes of prisoners could be seen, wearily filing down from the operational area. A sizable camp for Italian POWs had long been established just over the fence from our field. "For you, the war is over," rapidly became a stock phrase. There was now no shortage of jobs for communications flight. As the Eighth Army pushed the Italians and the Africa Corps relentlessly westwards, so we followed and found ourselves taking squadron observers to Benghazi or Derna, bringing sick types back to Alexandria from Tobruk, taking operations officers up the blue to supervise flying operations between Benghazi and Malta. Flying in and out of Benghazi was pretty hazardous until such time as the RAF caught up with the army and established themselves in that famous corner. The Luftwaffe maintained patrols over the area, fortunately at a great height and in no position to defend ourselves, for our Fulmars had been disarmed. We had perforce to sneak in and out at ground level in the hope that we wouldn't be seen. Sub-Lieutenant A. R. Brooks, RNVR, Taffy Thomas, airfitter, 775 Squadron, and the author involved in the entertainment business in 1943. One of the duties of our flight entailed having aircraft at standby to take up the desert naval commanders, who had long been appointed to take charge of harbours, as and when they fell to the Eighth Army. They were sorely needed, for one road and one railway line alone could not cope with the ever-increasing traffic. Supplementation by sea transport was urgently required. Now we hunted all over the blue for somewhere to deposit our commanders. We lobbed down in some strange places indeed. Ex-Luftwaffe fighter strips, straight stretches of road, hard patches of sand in the middle of nowhere. We were warned off some desert strips by the army because of mines. We landed at others, disconcerted to see a vehicle 30 yards away go up in a puff of smoke. When we reached Benghazi, we found the town deserted, booby-trapped to glory, and with all the water supply most thoroughly and efficiently poisoned. Benghazi was an odd city at this juncture of the war. To a man, the Italian population had migrated to the west, leaving behind them a deserted, eerily empty town. It had been an attractive place too, situated on a well-watered coastal strip, well cultivated with parks and gardens, and with some most impressive villas. It had obviously been a good place to live. The army had, of course, made a bit of a shambles of the town whilst busily liberating it, but one could still get a very good impression of what it had been. There was a fair amount of looting being done by the forces, despite the proliferation of ingeniously set booby traps, which proved to be some deterrent. We ourselves purloined 3 lavatory seats in an effort to raise the standard of civilization at our outpost. We were bombed quite heartily by Ju-88s most mornings at dawn, but we were safely abed in a deep Italian airfield store with feet of concrete above us. Their greatest, and to us most tragic, achievement was to knock out a newly arrived merchantman, part of whose cargo, as yet unloaded, consisted of naffy supplies. The beer was a sad miss. We had to keep plugging away at the vino, mainly Chianti, which we discovered in a store when our local expert, Barnes, of 825 Squadron, had safely removed the wired grenades. I had gone to Benghazi taking as a passenger a commander, operations, for our 2 Albacore squadrons which were now required in Malta. On arrival there, my Fulmar had become unserviceable, and a few days elapsed before spares could be flown up from Alex. I lived with the Albacore boys and thoroughly enjoyed myself. The food was a bit limited. Every meal was the same: ship's biscuits, Australian tinned bacon and Chianti. But at least there were no unpleasant surprises. The water, pumped from local oases some miles away by army engineers, certainly tasted as though the army had had something to do with it, but the vino helped. The Luftwaffe persevered with their morning hate, but none of us was killed. Young Barnes, mentioned briefly above, flaunted his mastery over the wiles of the Axis troops, and scared the hell out of us in so doing, by circumventing many of the booby traps to provide us with our few luxuries. He was a macabre soul, much engrossed in things that went off with a bang, and was usually encumbered with pockets bulging with jobs. Small Italian anti-personnel grenades with the nasty bits encased in bright red tin containers. He had a disconcerting habit of throwing these around the place whenever the mood came upon him, and seemed to derive great pleasure from the high-speed sprints with which the rest of us covered the sand. One of the lavatories, for which the seats had been removed from various desirable residences in the town suburbs, was a wooden job which stood, starkly alone, in the former Regia Aeronautica compound we had taken over. It was, for Barney, conveniently near the explosives dump from which he obtained his supply of red jobs. Coming from this dump early one morning, with pockets laden with the confounded things, he idly threw one which exploded with a rare detonation at the back of this wooden convenience. He was remarkably unrepentant when the door flew open, as if under the impact of an internal explosion, to allow his CO, Lieutenant Fairfax RN, to emerge at full speed and to make exceedingly good time for the underground hangar in which we lived and slept. As Barney-inspired runs went, it was nowhere near the world-beating class, but one can hardly expect a man fettered by trousers round his ankles to establish new records. Our mess back at Dequila was a great deal quieter once the Albacore squadrons had left us. They had done a good job during the months preceding the Alamein battle. It had been their hazardous duty to fly nightly over the German positions to drop flares, whilst RAF Wellingtons, flying considerably higher, bombed the enemy lines through them, a most uncomfortable role. Luckily, all their bombs fell on or somewhere near the Axis troops. Certainly none hit the albacores. Life for the next 3 months continued in the usual pattern, flying the airmail run, with occasional special trips in the Near East, and the odd exercise for the fleet. Our station obtained our radio sets, such as we had, from the RAF maintenance unit near Jaffa up in Palestine, and it was always a pleasant change to have a run up there to collect these. One day I took Lieutenant Thornycroft, one of our AEOs. Thorny was a devil for low flying, and was never happier than when the aircraft was batting across the delta at 0 feet. When we had left Port Said on our return journey, he asked me to do just that. We were approaching a village, not too far from Alex, which was much the same as any other delta settlement, a collection of hovels with one significant 2-story structure which was always the headman's house. Near this were 2 trees, between which Thorny suggested I might just squeeze a fulmar. I thought he was probably right, and he almost was. All I did was to clip one branch with my port wing, which transported Thorny into his 7th heaven of delight. When we reached Dequila, we found about 80 feet of wire draped from the Pitot head tube, and were at a loss as to where it had come from until we found an insulator at the other end. We had, it seemed, collected the wireless aerial suspended between the trees. However, things that go wrong are made to be put right, and the following day 2 of our mechanics ran out to the village and replaced it, with apologies, to everybody's entire satisfaction. And then the lease-lend agreement blossomed fully, and we were recalled. From the 4 corners of the earth, we stooge pilots were brought back to the UK, their lordships having raised a finger and beckoned us. In no time at all, I was climbing into a BOAC aircraft, a Liberator bomber converted into an airliner with about 16 seats, within sight of the pyramids, and we were off. The captain was named Vesey, and a fine chap he was too. He was one of the old Imperial Airways million-milers. One of the passengers was Lieutenant Commander Dunsterville, who, with Admiral Mountbatten, had survived the destruction of the destroyer Kelly in the famous withdrawal from Crete in 1941. Another passenger was an RAAF pilot called Jack Diamond, and since he and I were the lowest forms of animal life aboard, we quickly formed a friendship. We dropped into El Adem for fuel, and after passing round the south of the Mareth line, landed again at Algiers, where we took the opportunity to change into civvies, for Lisbon in neutral Portugal was to be our next port of call. It was late afternoon when we landed at Lisbon, and we circled for a few minutes to allow a Ju 52 to land before us. When we eventually reached the customs shed, the occupants of the Junkers were lined up on the other side of the barrier. They were bronzed, healthy-looking chaps, and well they might be, for they were Africa Corps men on their way to Germany for leave. In their unaccustomed civvies, they looked every bit as incongruous as we, in strange, ill-fitting flannels and sports jackets must have seemed to them. For a moment we stood, embarrassed and with averted eyes. Then someone chuckled, and in a second the whole room was roaring with laughter. Here we were, the 2 parties of us, sworn and deadly enemies in the midst of a world war, and all we could do was to giggle. Their lordships might have beckoned us. The trouble was that those who had beckoned hadn't told the other types what the beckoning was for. I arrived at the office of the Naval Assistant to the 2nd Sea Lord, who administers all things concerning air arm personnel. I rushed in, breathless and all agog, the sand of the desert still gritty in my socks and shoes, and burst forth to an aristocratic young lieutenant that I had just arrived from Egypt, and what was there for me to do? I awaited his reply with bated breath. He surveyed the nails of his left hand, covered a yawn delicately with his right, and sent me on indefinite leave. I had just settled down in Carlisle for a spell, revelling in Kathleen's company and in the heavenly cooking of my mother-in-law, when a telegram arrived urging me to report to St. Merrin with all dispatch. This, you will recall, was the fighter training station where I had served for a short time on my return from America. It was good to renew acquaintance with old friends, and we were soon busily engaged on a fighter refresher course, this time on Hurricanes, a new type to me. In no time at all we transferred our activities to Spitfire VBs, another new type, and naturally the buzz went round that we were destined for a Seafire squadron. The buzz hadn't gone full circle before we were sent on leave yet again. Apparently our aircraft were required for another squadron with more priority than ourselves. I wonder if they ever received them. So it was back to Carlisle, to my wife and our families, 18 hours in a train. They were faintly surprised to see me again so soon. A week later, I was on a train heading back to St Mirren, Carlisle to London, change for Cornwall. A lieutenant joined my compartment at Exeter. I recognised him as an instructor from St Mirren, and after a while he laid aside his evening paper. "Hanson, isn't it?" I said it was. "Thought you were on your way to the States." "Really? It's the first I've heard of it." "That's funny. I could have sworn I saw your name as having been posted there." We lapsed into silence. Later in the evening, as I left the dining mess to get a coffee in the wardroom, Captain's secretary came over to me. "Is it Hanson?" "Yes. Can you pop in to see me about 9 in the morning, old boy? Shan't keep you long." 0900 next morning saw me in his office. He entered 2 minutes later. "Ah, Hanson, yes. You're going to the States, old boy. Got a posting for you as senior pilot of 1833 Squadron, new American aircraft. You have to report to Donibristol for passage. Here are your orders." What a bloody outfit to be with, I thought. They really don't know their arse from their elbow. "And when do I go?" "Right now, old boy. In fact, quick as you can. There's a rail warrant with your papers. Crack on. Good luck." 18 hours back to Carlisle. It's just a bit bloody thick, I grumbled to myself. I grumbled even more bloody-mindedly after standing 7 hours in a train corridor from Euston to Carlisle. I stayed overnight with Kathleen. She now wondered, as so many millions have done in their time, if the government really knew what it was doing. There was no call for wonderment. The simple answer was that they didn't. Thanks be to God, the Third Reich managed to create the most diabolical shambles equally as skillfully as the British Empire upon which the sun never set. Otherwise, I hate to think what might have happened to all of us, the bent-wing soldier from Connecticut. We sailed from Liverpool's Prince's Landing Stage in RMS Empress of Scotland, which was conveying 1,300 Afrika Korps prisoners to the United States. They were quartered in the after part of that great ship, and were allowed to emerge for several hours a day for fresh air and exercise on the after upper deck. Here they were securely caged in by wire netting and barbed wire, overlooked by army Bren gunners perched on the surrounding deckhouses. We weren't overdoing the precautions, for these were hard boys, bronzed and fit after their service in North Africa. One of our duties as passenger officers was to stand watches on the afterbridge, keeping an eye on the Germans. Our other major cargo comprised several hundred naval ratings going out to man landing craft and assault boats, which were building in American yards ready for D-Day in a year's time. They were young, green and vulnerable, and the Germans weren't slow to cotton on. They soon got around to begging cigarettes and chocolate from sailors passing their cages. Having made their acquaintance, they proceeded to frighten the living daylights out of them by confiding that they hadn't a hope in hell of ever reaching America. U-boats had been organized to intercept the ship in mid-ocean. The Afrika Korps would take over the ship, and any friends the Germans had made among the British would be well looked after. The impact of this war of nerves upon the young sailors, most of whom were still boys, was such that the executive commander was eventually obliged to make a public announcement to the effect that, in the unlikely event of U-boat intervention, the Germans would certainly not take over the ship. Indeed, with equal certainty, they would be the last, and he repeated, the last, to leave the sinking ship. That finished it. We eventually sailed into Newport News, Virginia, where the American Army had set up a typically efficient organization for POW reception. The tide was high and the gangway steep, and the Germans, who were disembarked first, found it difficult to keep their feet as they descended to the concrete quay, holding the gangway rail with one hand and clutching all their worldly possessions with the other. As the leading man set foot upon the soil of America and raised his eyes for the first time, he found himself confronted by an enormous snowball, a large young American MP wearing a white helmet and grasping a submachine gun with no lack of determination. To a member of the master race, this was an insult that could not be borne. He promptly sat down on the concrete, bringing the descending queue behind him to a standstill. This was something the young American hadn't bargained for. He stood, perplexed. He had heard of Germans, but had never seen one, and this chap's behaviour was beyond him. He walked slowly across to the reception huts to seek guidance from an army lieutenant standing by the open door. We, leaning over the ship's rails, watching the fun, saw the lieutenant gesticulating violently. The MP came back at the double. His large boot sank into the backside of the offending German. "Come on, Joe! Let's go, eh?" he shouted, rounding off with a hefty prod of the machine gun on the same backside. The German uttered a sigh and slowly rose to his feet, looked round, then grudgingly walked to the huts. What on earth would the Führer have to say about this? An hour later, the nucleus of 1833 Squadron, our CO, H.A., Eric, Monk, two other reasonably experienced pilots, Steve Starkey and Bod Boddington, the senior pilot and 150 ratings, descended the same gangway. With us was a similar nucleus of 1834 Squadron. In the States, we would join 1830 and 1831 squadrons, who had sailed a month or two earlier. Together, we would be the first four squadrons to operate the new Chancevort Corsair in the Royal Navy. We were destined for a U.S. Naval Air Station at Quonset Point, Rhode Island, but apparently some hold-up in the matter of accommodation, either for us or for our aircraft, caused us to idle away a fortnight in New York. Men vary as to their willingness or otherwise to kick their heels, but it's no joke to lounge around in the sweltering heat and humidity of high summer in New York. Fortunately, I had struck up an acquaintance with Johnny Bird, a pilot in 1834 Squadron, whose father was Commander Bird, the big chief at Supermarine. Johnny came across to the States armed with a portfolio of letters of introduction to who's who in American aviation and invited me to string along. This made life very interesting indeed. We were given a full day at the Grumman factory on Long Island, shown Hellcats in all stages of production and entertained to lunch by Leroy Grumman himself. His chief test pilot threw a Hellcat around for our special benefit. We met the secretary of the Aviation Institute and through his influence visited several meteorological and aeronautical institutes. We were also invited to a world premiere at the Waldorf Astoria. Up to this time, American military aviation was still sharply divided between the Naval Air Corps and the Army Air Corps, and great was the gulf between them. Seversky, the great airman and eminent authority on aeronautics of Russian origin, had recently published his book Victory Through Air Power, and Walt Disney had been sufficiently impressed by it to make a movie in support. Briefly, the argument was that whilst their two air forces undoubtedly gave the necessary support to their respective arms of the fighting services, the war, and the war in the Pacific in particular, would not be won until America developed an independent striking air force. Seversky didn't actually say so in as many words, but what he obviously had in mind was the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command. It was to the world premiere of this film that we were invited. It was an evening for young men to remember. We were introduced as though we were admirals of the fleet. We were seated at the high table. We were plied with the Waldorf's best food and wine. We were consulted on matters relating to naval aviation, as though we were an airborne Delphic oracle. I like to think that we remembered how green we were, that we didn't allow the liquor to run away with our tongues, and that we didn't say anything too damn silly. But it was all fun. Among the many notabilities we met was Mrs. Mitchell, widow of General Billy Mitchell, who had shattered the entire American fighting service some years earlier by announcing that a battleship could be sunk by bombs dropped by an aircraft. He made himself damned unpopular with the Navy by saying so. So they gave him a battleship which he promptly sank, thereby making himself more unpopular still. Long after he was dead, they forgave him, which wasn't a lot of use to General Billy Mitchell. Anyway, they were jolly nice to his widow, which I suppose was better than nothing. Altogether, it was quite an evening. I can recommend the Waldorf Astoria. Each morning we heard dreadful tidings of pilots being killed in Corsairs. Then suddenly when I felt there couldn't be any Corsairs left for us to fly, we found ourselves at Quonset Point. After supper on the first evening, the CO came across to me. "Feel like a stroll, Hans?" We walked up to the hangar that had been allocated to us. There was an armed sentry on guard, but Eric told him to open up and turn on the lights. For some reason or other, we headed up a flight of stairs leading onto a balcony running the length of the hangar. Just then the lights came on, and there they were. Corsairs filled the hangar floor, and I must say that, of all the aircraft I had seen, these were the most wicked-looking bastards. They looked truly vicious, and it took little imagination to realize why so many American boys had found it difficult, if not well-nigh impossible, to master them, especially in deck landing. We stared at them and hadn't a word to say. Let's look round the rest of the setup. We allocated offices, we checked storerooms, crew rooms, repair shops. Everything was in order. There were new typewriters, desks, filing cabinets, everything that we could wish for. The Americans don't mess about, they do the job properly. I tried one of the typewriters, a beautiful machine. I found a sheet of quarto and typed, and what I typed was my last will and testament. I saw no reason why a Corsair shouldn't kill me when it could obviously kill so many other lads without any trouble. It certainly wasn't going to catch me unawares. It can't have been such a damn fool thing to do, for Eric didn't laugh when I told him. He was a bit pensive himself, and I think he reckoned I was employing myself much more usefully than I would have been in practicing. The quick brown fox jumps right over the lazy dog. The next day we collected the rest of our pilots, straight from USN flying schools, WK, Bash, Munnock, Peter Bilder, Reggie Shaw, all from England, Gordon Aitken from Ceylon, Johnny Baker from Toronto, and our only New Zealander, Neil Brynildson. Now we were 10, our full complement. KL, Bod Boddington, was the first of our truly professional womanizers. As the commission wore on, we were to find we had amateurs both charming and skillful, learners and graduates. But Bod was a master, and, for a young man, breathtakingly experienced. He was well built, inclined to chubbiness, everlasting cheerful, and highly competent in laying on charm to any required thickness. He first demonstrated his paces to us in New York. One evening, suffering from a fiendish headache, he descended to the drugstore on the ground floor of the Barbizon Plaza Hotel. 2 floors of this skyscraper were the compulsory home of every RN officer required to be in the city of New York, to buy some aspirin or some such before setting out on his evening's fun and games. Whilst awaiting service, he started to chat up the nearest female, a compulsive practice where he was concerned. She was, he said, about 30, and he gathered that she had a problem with her nerves for which she was now seeking something in the way of a tranquilizer. Bod tutted and deared, and, as he hoped, was duly invited to her room to discuss the problem. It seems that some 10 years earlier, whilst sunning herself in Florida, she had fallen in with a Texan gentleman who had taken quite a fancy to her. They had corresponded and exchanged snapshots at long range ever since. Over the years, things had progressed to the stage where matrimony had not been discussed, but had eventually reached probability. Finally, a wedding had been arranged, and she was now en route from her home in Vermont to Dallas, Texas, where the nuptials would be celebrated in 4 days' time. Now, after 10 years, she wondered if this Texan was in fact the man of her dreams, hence the worry. A doubtful story. Furthermore, her virginal state, even more doubtful, was outraged at the very idea of consummation. What did Mr. Boddington think? Mr. Boddington thought hard, then decided he might think more clearly if he removed his trousers. Having done so, he gave the lady certain advice from the depths of his experience which prompted her, too, to undress. Bod said later that the removal of her extensive and highly complicated harness was something at which his mind boggled, particularly, as he put it, when the removal of her bra, followed by 2 substantial thuds on the carpet, produced from his lips an involuntary Jesus Christ. However, as an old Whitgiftian, he knew where his duty lay. She was apparently most grateful for his advice, and especially for the dummy run. They had a few noggins together as part of the recuperative process. Next morning, even he was somewhat disinclined to believe her fanciful yarn. He was also doubtful about her age. She could have been 40, maybe 50. But, as he said, what the hell? After that, he rambled on in a vague kind of way, something about the aesthetic value of a performance of the Elgar Concerto played on an extremely old Amati violin. As far as I was concerned, we had been allocated a fine bunch of lads. All of them were young, in their early 20s. One or two of them were fairly serious, introspective chaps, Steve Starkey, Reggie Shaw and Gordon Aitken. Keith Monnock had come from the Royal Marines, somewhat sombre but with flashes of real fun. Johnny Baker, the Canadian, was old for his years, but with the fresh, uninhibited outlook of a boy from the Dominions, while Brynildson was a quiet, enigmatic New Zealander, and Peter Bilder, an English boy, was engagingly round the bend. Brynildson was a slightly built, bird-like young man, quaint and with the driest of wits. There were times when he drank considerably more than was good for him, and, in his cups, he was capable of doing remarkable things. It was said by his chums that on an overnight journey from Detroit to Miami, a change of trains at Jacksonville had been necessary in the early hours of the morning. When the troops were rounded up to embark for Miami, Neil could not be found. Eventually the panic stage was reached, with every man available milling around like ants searching the very large station for the absentee. With only minutes to go, one of the lads was surprised to see a Royal Naval officer's cap badge moving up and down within a telephone kiosk, rather like a Punch and Judy show. Closer investigation revealed Brynildson, very much the worse for wear, leisurely and uncertainly struggling into pyjamas. He had looked at his watch and decided it was bedtime. They got him aboard the train in the nick of time, smartly clad in his cap, reefer jacket, pyjama trousers, and with his shoes in his hand, whilst his chum toted the rest of his gear. We couldn't have wished for greater variety. All of them, with the exception of Starkey, Boddington and the CO, had been trained with the US Navy and were therefore well versed in American aircraft terminology and instrumentation. This naturally helped them to find their way around the massive cockpit of their new fighter. It contained more than enough to keep them busy for a long time to come. For some months, Corsairs were decidedly tricky aircraft to handle. For one thing, they were damnably big fighters for their day. They had a vast length of fuselage between the cockpit and the propeller, which, together with a rather low sitting position and a not-too-clever hood, both of which were modified and greatly improved in the Mark II version, made for very poor visibility when taxiing and landing. It was pretty long-legged in the undercarriage department in order to give clearance to the great propeller, said to be the biggest ever fitted to a single-engined fighter. To increase the clearance, which undercarriage alone could never have achieved, the wings were of inverted gull format, dipping downwards for about 4 feet from the wing root at the fuselage, then rising sharply to the wingtip. Not for nothing was it called the bent-wing bastard from Connecticut. Its armament consisted of 6.5-inch Browning machine guns, hydraulically charged and electrically fired. The radial engine was a Pratt & Whitney R2800, developing 2,000 GP from 18 cylinders arranged in 2 banks of 9. Fuel was supplied to the engine through a Stromberg injection carburettor, which precluded cutting out on the top of a loop, a disconcerting feature to which aircraft fitted with the normal carburettor were prone. A 2-stage supercharger was fitted. The first stage was engaged at 10,000 feet and the second at 19,000 feet. The aircraft was capable of producing a genuine speed of over 400 miles per hour at its rated altitude of around 22,000 feet. The Corsair was a rugged machine which could take any amount of punishment on the flight deck and appeared to make light of it. Everything about it was high class, and great attention to detail proclaimed itself wherever one looked. The cockpit was meticulously arranged with all dials readily visible, and every lever and switch comfortably and conveniently to hand, without any need to search or grope. Infinitely superior, I may say, to the cockpits of British aircraft of that time, which suggested by comparison that they had been designed by the administrative office charwoman. The aircraft had 2 built-in safety devices which were worth their weight in gold if hydraulic trouble arose. Both undercarriage and arrestor hook were hydraulically actuated. Should hydraulic pressure be lost, the hook fell automatically, ready for a deck landing. The use of the undercarriage, too, was protected. One simply had to select down on the undercarriage lever and then open a CO2 bottle which effectively blew down the wheels into the landing locked position. Rumour had it that the prototypes had been equipped with spin chutes in their tails to effect recovery from that deadly enemy, the spin. Whether it was true or not, the pilot's handling notes were emphatic on the point that spins should not be deliberately undertaken, for recovery was dubious, if not downright impossible. It might be mentioned that the notes referred to were a highly important and integral part of becoming a fit and proper pilot for a single-seat aircraft in those days. They had to be studied carefully, first on the ground for 2 or 3 days, and then sitting in the aircraft on the ground, learning the position of all the bits and pieces in the cockpit. Nowadays, manufacturers build 2-seater versions of most aircraft, so that dual instruction can be given before a pilot is allowed to fly the aircraft solo. The fighter had originally been ordered by the US Navy for carrier use to replace the Grumman F-4F, the Wildcat, martlet to the Royal Navy. But it had proved to be such a handful in fleet trials, particularly in deck landing, that the new Grumman F-6F, the Hellcat, had been adopted instead. The F-4U, the Corsair, could now go to the shore-based squadrons of the US Marine Air Corps and to the Royal Navy if they wanted it. The Royal Navy accepted it willingly. The only alternatives in sight were the Seafire and Sea Hurricane, RAF production models fitted with arrestor hooks, and these just weren't carrier material. Their range was pathetically limited, even with drop tanks, and worse still, their structure, whilst perfectly adequate for airfield flying, was not up to the rough-and-tumble life of carrier decks. In both cases, a heavy landing, caused either by the vessel's pitch or by the pilot's ham-fistedness, often brought the undercarriage through the wings. Somehow or other, the Royal Navy would see to it that the Corsair could be deck-landed. Our familiarization flights produced 1 or 2 prangs. Brynildson put his job onto its nose on the 3rd day, and Starkey turned his aircraft onto its back when braking too enthusiastically. But the 3rd was deadly. Just over a week after we started flying, Boddington was coming in for a landing over the James River when he inadvertently put himself into the slipstream of a Grumman Avenger landing in front of him. He was practically down to stalling speed and had neither time nor airspace to recover from the incipient spin which befell him. In the early hours of the morning, US Navy divers brought him up, still strapped in his Corsair, with a wound on the side of his head. Had he been killed outright, or had he drowned whilst unconscious? Whatever the reason, we had lost dear old Bod. We were out one evening, drinking at a pub between Quonset Point and Providence, when we ran into some US Army pilots working up squadrons of Republic Thunderbolts, the Army's latest interceptors. Inevitably there ensued great argument on the relative merits of ours and theirs. There was extensive waving of hands all over the bar. There were loud shouts of "balls" and "nuts" and "for Christ's sake stop talking cock," and similarly endearing remarks which invariably punctuate flying talk. A lieutenant finally suggested to me that all this was getting us nowhere. Why didn't we pitch a mock battle with gun cameras to prove which was the better aircraft? What a great idea! In the absence of our CO, who wasn't much of a drinking man, I committed us to a battle, 6 aside, for the following afternoon at 1600, at 10,000 feet over the James River Bridge. Done, handshakes all round. The boss absolutely jumped at it. His eyes sparkled and he just couldn't wait. He grinned even more as he said, "You said 1600, Hans?" "Yes, sir, at 10,000 feet. "Great! We'll show 'em!" And we did show them. For Charlie Orange, CO, was an old hand, and you had to be up very bright and early to put one over him. At 15:45 the next day we were sitting up sun over the bridge, not at 10,000 but at 16,000 feet. When the American boys arrived 5 minutes early in very tiddly formation, we fell upon them from a great height, as the Assyrians, like a wolf on the fold. In 2 minutes it was all over. I had learnt another lesson. War doesn't begin at midnight. It starts at 23:55 and gives you the drop on the sucker. To replace Boddington, we were fortunate enough to be given Eric Rogers, a tall, slim lad of 23 who hailed from Birmingham. He was to become one of the squadron's happiest assets, for he was fun, unlimited, with a face full of grins and a laugh that would have started a corsair. His first remark to me about a corsair's cockpit, "It's all tits and clocks, isn't it?" endeared him to me. The fact that he was a competent bridge player certainly enhanced his standing with the CO, although I doubt whether his endless gaiety and, to me, enchanting attitude of treating life as lightly as possible had the same effect. He had trained with Reggie Shaw, and they quickly became firm friends. After a few weeks, we moved up to another station at Brunswick, Maine, not many miles from the coast. The whole of New England is lovely country, and we had found Rhode Island to be a beautiful state. Maine, in our opinion, was even better. The coastline was sheer magic, indented with Norwegian-like fjords and thickly forested with trees now, in the autumn, turning to pastel shades of pale to rich gold and salmon pink. Offshore, there was a necklace of small islands which provide summer homes and hotels for the hot, dusty, tired and rich New Yorkers. We worked like blazes at Brunswick in an attempt to attain a reasonable standard of efficiency before we returned to the UK. I started none too well. Sent by the CO on the first morning to do a recce to learn the lie of the land, I set off up the coast for 20 to 30 minutes, then turned around and headed southwestwards. So engrossed was I with the beauty of the scenery that I stupidly dropped my map into the bottom of the cockpit. There was no deck as in a Fulmar, where it would remain out of reach until I landed. Sure enough, I became well and truly lost. I wasn't worried. I was off the northeastern coast of the US. If my full tank of petrol lasted the course, I would surely recognize New York in the fullness of time. Not to worry. Suddenly, out of the heat haze below me, I found myself approaching a large city with extensive docks and no end of shipping. I was trying to picture the map when I saw an airliner, a Dakota, heading towards the coast, just lowering its undercarriage. He would know where he was. I followed him in, not too closely, for the airliner boys were a bit sensitive if military aircraft became too friendly. With 50 or so paying passengers aboard, they were in no position to take violent evasive action. I let him land and clear the runway, then followed him in. At the end of the runway, I was directed to the northern end of the field and fetched up outside a hangar bearing the words, "Civil Air Guard." I switched off and jumped down. "Sorry to drop in on you uninvited. I lost my way half an hour ago and am hopelessly lost." At least I was honest. "Lieutenant, sir." A hearty handshake and a very large smile. "It's a very real pleasure and a great privilege to welcome the Royal Navy." My corsair bore the magic words on the fuselage. "You're at Portland, Maine, sir, and we'd be glad if you would come in and accept our hospitality." So off we went to the operations room. I was duly introduced to everybody in sight. An opened bottle of Coke was pressed into one hand, a cigarette into the other, and a lighter flashed into life before my face. You couldn't meet nicer guys. Did I come from London? What was the bombing like? Was I married? Oh, gee, did my poor wife live in a shelter? How soon would it be before we gave those Kraut bastards what was coming to them? The war in Europe satisfactorily disposed of, we got down to domestic detail. Where was I based? Were the Brunswick people nice to us? Were they finding us plenty of girls? This is a national concern with Americans. No matter what else, visitors must never want for an adequate supply of feminine company. What the hell was that damn big fighter standing, so to speak, at the door? Looked a bastard to fly. They sure hadn't had one of them in Portland before. When I had signed the visitor's book, with home address Carlisle and Royal Navy, in large letters and carefully underlined, duly appended, I was allowed to leave, complete with brand new map and gushing promises of real hospitality and plenty of girls on my next visit. They are the friendliest and kindest people in the world. Monk flew our pants off, practicing formation flying in both close and open patrol formation. We did map-reading exercises over the quiet highlands towards the Canadian border. We practiced low flying well out to sea and managed, with a modicum of skill and the hell of a lot of luck, to avoid embarrassing collisions with coastal freighters, lightships and pleasure cruisers. We did thousands of circuits of the little airfield at Rockland, a delightful spot further up the coast, in one of the finest parts of New England, practicing dummy deck landings. We blazed away thousands of rounds of ammunition at towed targets, taking it in turn to tow the drogue and hoping that the boys would remember that we were pulling, not pushing, the confused thing. Early one morning, young Monteith, of 1831 Squadron, pressed his trigger to produce the shot of the year. He was doing a high-side run on the drogue, diving on it from one side, from a height advantage of 500 or 600 feet, and failed to notice that far, far below him was one of the pretty little islands that adorn the coast of Maine, tastefully inhabited. Two of his .5-inch bullets, fair-sized chunks of armor-piercing steel, travelling at the speed of sound, tore through the outer wall of a hotel into a bathroom, where a retired colonel was leisurely bathing his middle-aged frame. Having noisily effected their entrance, the bullets then proceeded to hammer their way through the side of his bath at a downward angle of some 60 degrees, zipped across his thighs into the water, and perforated the bath on the other side, thereby making completely unnecessary the removal of the plug for emptying purposes. Needless to say, such marksmanship didn't go down well. The weeks passed and we were progressing. Our ratings were getting to know us, and one another. The pilots were gingerly experimenting with their Corsairs, and all of us were trying to understand what our new commanding officer expected of us. My own opinion was that he expected far too much from the boys in too short a time. Their flying experience was brief, and even briefer was their experience with the Corsair, which was proving to be a handful for even the most competent naval aviators of two nations. Apart from learning to handle their aircraft, they were still learning to be officers. Occasionally, when a suitable moment presented itself, I would remind him that they were still a long, long way from being hot-shot fighter pilots. To the young men, for I was by years older than the oldest of them, I tried to explain that the flurries of temper and full-strength nautical language to which they were regularly subjected were all part of the game of being a CO, and that their skins would quickly become adjusted to the required thickness. For, let's face it, Eric Monk took quite a time to adjust himself to being the boss of a squadron of RNVR pilots. He himself was RN and had served in the Royal Navy from the age of 14 until now. At his present age of 25 or 26, he had attained the rank of lieutenant commander. He had enjoyed a brilliant career. From the deck of Ark Royal, he had fought over Norway and had been awarded 2 DSMs within a matter of days. He had been at war on the first day, September 3, 1939, when the rest of us were civilians, when some of us, in fact, had been schoolboys. Accustomed as he had been all his life to RN discipline, it was readily understandable to me that it should take him some time to assess what our sort of discipline was worth, for in its informality and fifth-form flavour, it certainly didn't match up to his ideas. The youngsters needed all the courage they could muster, though, for the Corsair continued to exact its toll. It was certainly no aircraft for a Sprog pilot. It made no concessions to inexperience or nervousness, and reacted viciously to the slightest ham-fistedness on the controls. Its very size was enough to daunt the bravest, and its engine power was staggering in comparison with those machines which even our experienced pilots had coped with so far in their careers. It carried a lot of gubbins, which were all new to us, a cockpit full of switches, levers, dials, and gadgets, which demanded one's undivided attention. When that attention lapsed or wandered, things happened, and happened very quickly. A youngster called Harris from 1830 Squadron was flying high, about 23,000 feet, over Brunswick town at noon. He was tearing along at high speed with full supercharger going. This was a small turbine of bewilderingly high revolutions positioned at the rear of the power unit, which at high altitude forced the petrol-air mixture into the engine under very high pressure. Quite suddenly, the engine packed in through failure of the ignition system. Both magnetos were pressurized for high-altitude flying, but at this stage the pressurization system wasn't yet perfected. Harris glided down to around 16,000 feet, a height at which the magnetos decided to recommence operating and the engine cut in again. The boy had already committed himself to a searing and explosive death. At this moment he had split seconds to live. When the engine cut out, he had obviously forgotten to withdraw the supercharger. Now, as the engine, from inertia, burst into life again at a high throttle setting, the thrust exerted on the bearings of the supercharger was too much. The rear of the power unit completely destroyed itself, with hardened steel tearing through fuselage, cockpit, wings, and Harris. Down in Brunswick it was lunchtime, and the main street was as busy as a bee. In the centre of the roadway stood a policeman controlling a school crossing. He looked upwards, perplexed by a strange whining. With commendable alacrity he leapt back a couple of paces as a Pratt & Whitney engine, weighing around 2 tons, hurtled down from a bright blue sky to bury itself in the tarmac in front of him. Nobody was hurt, but the Corsair was scattered far and wide, and the young pilot had virtually disappeared. Another dreadful accident occurred whilst we were at Brunswick. A new squadron, 1836, was practising, flying in 2 columns in line astern, the columns being led by the CO and the senior pilot. The CO decided to do a turn, in which direction we shall never know. Some faulty communication between the two of them occurred, with the result that he and his senior pilot turned into one another, and both were killed. It was fortunate that the rest of the pilots, inexperienced in this manoeuvre, were not flying as close to their leaders as they would have been in the months to come, and had time and space to avoid doing the same thing to themselves. It was a shocking waste of good, experienced pilots that they should lose their lives in a blinding flash of carelessness or stupidity. Being young, we weathered these hard knocks. Youth and flying survive on the easy assumption that it can happen to the other fellow, but it will never happen to me. Without that, most of us would never have survived the war. At the end of September 1943, we were posted home to the UK. We were to fly to Norfolk, Virginia, for passage in Trumpeter, a newly commissioned escort carrier. Despite the thousands of ADDLs that we had done, there was to be no time for initial deck landings. We would undergo those at home. The intention was to do the flight non-stop. However, as we flew wondrously down the length of the great man-made cliffs of Manhattan, an RT call was made which made me laugh aloud. Our young men were really growing up. Red 3 to Charlie Orange, I'm running out of gas, over. We were flying down Fifth Avenue, so to speak, in a beautiful tight formation at the time, and this urgent call was something the CO could not afford to ignore, whether or not he believed it. I could hardly see him taking a chance on one of his sprogs trying a rather fancy forced landing outside Tiffany's. The very idea must have appalled him. He called up US Naval Air Station at Floyd Bennett Field on Long Island, and in 2 minutes we were landing. Obviously, it was now too late in the day to refuel, eat, and continue the flight to Virginia. When we were cordially invited to stay for the night, we snatched the offer with both hands. Next morning it was raining cats and dogs. For 2 happy days and nights we trudged the streets of little old New York, awash with rain. Then the front cleared, and off we went again. That day produced an occasion which none of us had so far experienced and would never experience again. We landed on the Navy airfield, and our Corsairs were to be hoisted by crane aboard the ship as deck cargo. To reach the docks, we had to taxi our planes through the outskirts of the town, with our wings folded, causing quite a furore amongst the street traffic. It was something our training had never envisaged when we held out our right hand to signify we intended to make a right turn, to be answered by the traffic cop with the customary wave of his hands and a big grin on his face. Our voyage in Trumpeter was notable. The ship was part of the escort to an enormous convoy taking GIs to Northern Ireland, the first part of the build-up for the coming of D-Day in 8 months' time. We picked up the liners transporting the personnel in New York and continued up to Halifax, Nova Scotia, to collect the merchantmen conveying their weapons and vehicles. The German High Command knew all about that convoy. Their U-boats were busy even as we ploughed northwards up the coast of New England, and the packs were summoned as we set out across the wide Atlantic at 14 knots. Off Newfoundland we ran into the dreaded fog which brought visibility down to a matter of yards. All passenger officers were put on a duty rota to stand watches on all sides of the ship to keep station on the fog buoys, which all the ships in company were streaming. We carried a few swordfish for AS patrols, and it broke our hearts when two of these, at the end of a long patrol, could not be directed through the diabolical fog to be landed aboard. Inevitably, they ran out of petrol and had to ditch. Despite magnificent efforts made by Canadian aircraft operating from Newfoundland, they were never seen again. Apart from our ship, the remainder of the escort was completely American. Their destroyers, no doubt revelling in the novelty of conveying something really worthwhile, had the time of their lives, dashing around with the utmost gusto to throw out at regular intervals millions of dollars of taxpayers' money in the form of showers of depth charges. They were good. It speaks volumes for them that of all the U-boats which were known to be trailing us, or rather vectoring on us, for at our speed they couldn't possibly have kept up with us, not one was allowed to put herself into a position from which to mount a serious attack. I was sharing a cabin, well below the waterline, with the captain's secretary. Our bunks, the upper one occupied by him, with myself in the lower, were fixed to the ship's side, which, since the hull was that of a merchantman, was little more than thickish tin plate. About midnight, some keen destroyer type let go a pattern of depth charges too close to our starboard side for comfort. The underwater hull of our ship whipped under the concussion and ejected me neatly to the strip of carpet on the deck. Sec, for some reason or other, managed to stay firmly in his bunk. We came into Belfast Lough on a miserable October day, groping our way through driving rain to a quayside at Sydenham Airfield. It continued to rain for 3 days. We were billeted in a church hall and slept on scruffy straw palliasses. We ate indifferent food, and we walked the streets of Belfast until such time as the cinemas, or the pubs, opened. The streets were full of GIs wandering around in the rain looking for something to do, strangers in a strange land. No less than 3 groups of them stopped us to ask if we had been part of the escort bringing them across. We said we had been, a white lie, for we had been passengers no less than they. They embarrassed us considerably by insisting on shaking our hands to thank us for a safe arrival. One young boy confided to me that the Atlantic Ocean was one hell of a lot of water. He came from Missouri and had never seen the sea in his life until he sailed out of the Hudson River. I'm not surprised he was astonished. The CO was beside himself with impatience, but even he could do nothing about the weather. Then one morning he burst into the office. "Get 'em lined up, Hans! We're going!" I looked outside and saw, through the rain, a thin streak of light on the eastern horizon. Farewell to Belfast. We flew across the Irish Sea in a horizontal corridor of fair weather, sandwiched between thick fog cloud beneath us and heavy nimbus above. As we entered Liverpool Bay, it cleared altogether for a few miles, but things ahead looked grim. However, we would cope with that when we reached it. At that moment, Eric Rogers, down on my starboard side, started yelping about his engine. I looked down at him and saw great gouts of black smoke belching from his exhaust manifold. "Stay with him and look after him, Hans," the CO said. I dropped down to Rog. After a minute or two, "There's a lovely fat merchantman right below you, Eric. Ditch beside him, give him a nice kiss, and he might even pick you up." For once, Rogers was in no mood for wisecracking. "Sod that for a lark! I've got a load of loot in this thing, and I mean to get it to Birmingham." The Wirral Peninsula was coming up now. Do it your own way. Take the merchantman, or, if you can hang on for a minute or two, there's a lovely beach coming up. Keep cool, and you'll make it easily from this height. He was losing very little in the way of speed or altitude, and I was now sure that he would make Cheshire safely. I left him to it and batted after the squadron, who were fast disappearing. I caught up with them as they crossed the bar light. As we came up the Mersey, with the famous liver birds just visible through the murk, we hit the rain clouds, which looked solid from ground level to about 30,000 feet. I could practically hear the smack as we hit them. 1 second we were a neat, tidy formation. The next we were all to hell, milling around in the murk, stragglers fading out of sight. It was a dangerous moment, and nasty collisions could have occurred. The CO yelled and we turned 180 degrees. 9 of us had entered the cloud. When we emerged again into the comparative clear, we were only 7.